I don't exist. So they're all characters that I played, including Jim Carrey, including Joel Barish, including any of those things. They're all characters. Jim Carrey was a less intentional character,
Right.
because I thought I was just building something that people would like, but it was a character. I played the guy that was free from concern so that people who watched me would be free from concern.
Jim Carrey has long been seen by the public as the embodiment of joy. On screen and in interviews, he appears full of energy, constantly shifting his expressions and making people laugh within seconds. For millions of viewers, Carrey became the face of pure comedy, the man whose exaggerated faces and fearless humor could light up an entire room. But behind that cheerful image was a very different reality. Few people knew that as a teenager. Carrey once lived with his family in a van after his father lost his job. He left school early and worked manual labor jobs to help support his parents and siblings. Those years were marked by uncertainty and constant fear about survival. For decades, he rarely spoke publicly about that period of his life. Only after turning 60 did Carrey begin openly revealing what really happened during those years. And when the full story finally surfaced, many people realized that behind one of the most famous smiles in entertainment history was a life shaped by deep struggle and hidden pain. Childhood poverty and homelessness. The foundation of pain. Jim Carrey was born on January 17, 1962, in Ontario, Canada, and spent most of his childhood in the town of Newmarket. During his early years, his family lived a modest but stable middle-class life supported by the income of his father, Percy Carrey, who worked as an accountant. Percy was known within the family as a naturally funny and creative person who enjoyed performing impressions and entertaining his children with jokes. Jim would later say that his father was the first person who made him believe humor could become a powerful way to connect with people. Jim's mother, Kathleen Carrey, struggled with frequent health anxieties and regularly talked about serious illnesses that she believed she might have. Much of the household atmosphere revolved around her fears of medical problems, including discussions about heart issues or neurological disease. For a young child, these conversations created a constant sense of anxiety about the possibility of losing a parent. The family's situation changed dramatically when Jim was around 12 years old. Percy Carrey suddenly lost his accounting job, reportedly because companies were increasingly replacing older employees with younger workers. The loss of the family's main income pushed the household into a severe financial crisis within a short period of time. Without stable employment, Percy could no longer support the mortgage payments on their home, and the family eventually lost the house. After leaving their home, the family entered a period of homelessness. At different times, they lived inside a Volkswagen van or stayed temporarily in tents set up in parks around Ontario. Jim later spoke briefly about this period in interviews, explaining that his family had been homeless for a time and describing it simply as a very difficult chapter in his life. Financial pressure forced everyone in the family to work. As a teenager, Jim and his siblings took jobs as janitors and cleaners in a factory where the entire family worked night shifts. Their tasks included washing industrial floors, cleaning equipment, and scrubbing toilets after the factory closed for the evening. The work schedule often extended late into the night, and the physical labor was exhausting for teenagers who were still supposed to attend school during the day. Eventually, the schedule became impossible for Jim to maintain. After working long hours overnight, he struggled to stay awake in class and began falling behind in school. He ultimately left school around the 10th grade so he could help support the family through full-time work. The decision was not driven by a lack of interest in education, but by the financial pressure facing the household at the time. Beyond the physical hardship, the experience also created deep emotional stress. Jim later admitted that he felt strong embarrassment about his family's situation because many of his classmates had no idea that his family had lost their home. He worried constantly that someone at school might discover the truth about his living conditions. inside the household. The emotional atmosphere was already fragile. Kathleen's constant discussion of illness made young Jim fear that his parents might die at any moment. He later recalled moments when those fears overwhelmed him so strongly that he locked himself inside the bathroom and cried because he believed something terrible might happen to his family. Both of his parents were also heavy smokers, and because the family often lived in very small spaces, cigarette smoke filled the air for long periods of time, combined with financial instability and health anxieties. The environment created a constant feeling of tension and uncertainty during his formative years. During this difficult period, Jim slowly developed a coping mechanism that would later define his public identity. When he was alone, he spent long periods standing in front of a mirror while experimenting with exaggerated facial expressions, strange voices, and physical movements. These moments were not performances for an audience, but a private way to release tension and distract himself from the stress surrounding his family. Over time, the mirror became, in his own words, my best friend, because it allowed him to escape emotionally, even when his real circumstances were painful. By making himself laugh, he could briefly forget the instability around him and regain a sense of control over his emotions. Looking back as an adult, Jim Carrey acknowledged that those early hardships played a major role in shaping his personality. Humor became a form of protection that allowed him to transform fear and insecurity into creative expression. What began as a survival mechanism during a period of poverty and homelessness would later evolve into the comedic style that millions of people around the world would recognize. Early career failures. The struggle to be seen. By the late 1970s, Jim Carrey had already decided that comedy would become his path out of poverty. After years of financial instability during his teenage years, he saw performance as the only way to change the direction of his life. In the early 1980s, he moved to Los Angeles to pursue stand-up comedy full-time, believing that success in Hollywood could finally lift his family out of the struggles they had endured for years. The reality he encountered was far harsher than he expected. Los Angeles in the 1980s was highly competitive for young comedians. Hundreds of performers competed every night for a few minutes on stage in small clubs. One of the most important venues was the Comedy Store on Sunset Boulevard, a famous club where many comedians hoped to be discovered. Carrey began performing there regularly, but his early appearances were difficult. His style was unusual compared to many other comedians of the time. Instead of telling traditional jokes, he relied heavily on exaggerated facial expressions, strange physical movements, and rapid character impressions. Some audiences found the performances strange or confusing, and many early shows ended with boos from the crowd. In some cases, audience members openly mocked him while he was still on stage. For a young performer who had just arrived in Hollywood, these reactions were deeply discouraging. Stand-up comedy requires immediate audience feedback, which means rejection happens in public and in real time. Carrey experienced that rejection repeatedly during his first several years in Los Angeles. Financial pressure made the situation even harder. During some periods of the early 1980s, Carrey struggled to afford basic living expenses. Like many struggling performers, he sometimes slept in his car because he could not pay rent for a stable apartment. Money earned from occasional performances was unpredictable and often barely covered food and transportation. Despite the constant setbacks, he continued to practice intensely. Much of his preparation happened alone, just as he had done during his childhood. He spent long hours standing in front of a mirror, studying his own face and experimenting with extreme expressions. He practiced stretching his facial muscles, twisting his mouth, widening his eyes, and shifting between different voices in rapid succession. The mirror again became an important tool in his development. In later reflections and in his book, Memoirs and Misinformation, Carrey described the mirror as a strange kind of companion during those lonely years. because it allowed him to refine his performance style even when he had no audience. The mirror was often the only place where his unusual style felt accepted. The pressure to succeed remained constant. Carrey often said that his childhood experiences with poverty created a powerful motivation to achieve financial security. He wanted to build a career strong enough to support his family and prevent them from ever experiencing homelessness again. That goal gave him determination, but it also created intense psychological pressure. Over time, the combination of repeated rejection and financial stress led to periods of exhaustion and self-doubt. Carrey later admitted that there were moments when he seriously considered quitting comedy altogether. The constant cycle of hope, failure, and recovery was emotionally draining. Each unsuccessful performance felt like another reminder that his plan to change his life might not work. Yet comedy also functioned as a protective mechanism. Instead of abandoning the craft, he used humor as a shield against disappointment. Each failure pushed him to experiment further with his style, making his performances more physical, more exaggerated, and more unpredictable. Slowly, this unusual approach began attracting attention from certain producers and television executives who saw something unique in his energy. The breakthrough finally arrived in 1990 when Carrey joined the television sketch comedy series In Living Color. The show allowed him to create bizarre characters and exaggerated impressions that matched his natural style much better than traditional stand-up comedy. However, by the time that opportunity arrived, he had already spent nearly a decade facing rejection, unstable income, and public criticism. Those early struggles formed the emotional groundwork for the explosive success that would come later with films such as Ace Ventura, Pet Detective in 1994. By the time the world finally recognized him as a comedic superstar, Carrey had already endured years of professional setbacks that forced him to rebuild his confidence again and again. The long path through failure did not simply test his talent, it tested his endurance. Family loss and the battle with depression. During the 1990s, Jim Carrey experienced the most dramatic shift in his life. His public image was rising rapidly, and audiences around the world were beginning to recognize him as one of the most energetic comedians in entertainment. At the same time, his personal life was entering a period of deep loss that would shape his mental health for years. The first major blow came in 1991 with the death of his mother, Kathleen Carrey. Kathleen had struggled with health issues and chronic anxiety about illness for much of her life. Over time, her physical condition declined, and she eventually passed away after a long period of sickness. Her death happened just as Jim Carrey was beginning to gain small opportunities in television and film. The timing created a complicated emotional response. Carrey later admitted that he felt a strong sense of guilt because he had been focused on building his career during the period when his mother's health was deteriorating, although he had spent years supporting the family financially during his youth. He still felt that he had not been present enough during her final stage of life. Only 3 years later, another loss struck the family. In 1994, his father, Percy Carrey, died from lung cancer after a lifetime of heavy smoking. The death occurred during the same year that Carrey experienced his first massive commercial success with the film The Mask. The contrast between professional triumph and personal grief created a powerful emotional conflict. Percy had always been one of the most important figures in Jim's life. As a child, Jim had watched his father perform impressions and comedic characters at home. Those moments had strongly influenced his decision to pursue comedy. Because of that connection, Percy's death affected him deeply. In later interviews, Carrey described the loss of his father as a knockout punch. The phrase reflected how suddenly the emotional weight of grief hit him. Within only a few years, he had lost both parents. After these losses, Carrey began experiencing prolonged symptoms of depression. He later described the feeling not as a temporary sadness, but as a persistent emotional weight that stayed with him day after day. He reported experiencing difficulty sleeping, recurring negative thoughts, and a constant sense of internal pressure. To manage the symptoms, he began taking the antidepressant Prozac for a period of time. The medication helped stabilize his mood and allowed him to continue working. However, Carrey later explained that the treatment only reduced the intensity of the symptoms rather than addressing the deeper emotional causes. In interviews years later, he spoke openly about that period. In one conversation, he explained, "I was on Prozac for a long time. It helped. But then I realized I had to face it." During the late 1990s and early 2000s, the emotional struggle continued even as his career expanded into more dramatic roles. One of the most notable examples appeared in the film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Released in 2004, the character he played dealt with heartbreak, memory loss, and emotional isolation. Many observers noted that the role reflected a more vulnerable side of Carrey that had rarely been visible in his earlier comedic performances. At the same time, he began exploring new ways to manage his mental health. Carrey gradually reduced his reliance on medication and started focusing on spiritual and philosophical ideas about consciousness and identity. He became interested in meditation and began reading works by spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle, whose writings emphasize mindfulness and detachment from the ego. These ideas had a strong impact on his worldview. Carrey later described depression as a signal rather than simply a disease. He explained that the experience forced him to reconsider how he defined success, identity, and happiness. Despite the professional achievements that continued to follow, the emotional effects of losing both parents remained part of his internal life. The grief from those years did not disappear completely, but it pushed him to rethink how he understood pain and personal transformation. The decade that brought him global fame also became the decade that introduced him to the deepest psychological struggle of his life: broken relationships and the peak of personal tragedy. The personal life of Jim Carrey has been marked by a series of intense relationships that often ended in painful ways, from the late 1980s to the present. Several of his romantic relationships collapsed under pressure, emotional strain, or public scrutiny. Over time, these repeated losses created another layer of psychological difficulty in his life, eventually culminating in the most controversial tragedy he would ever face. Carrey's first marriage began in 1987 when he married Melissa Womer, an actress and comedy club waitress whom he met during his early stand-up years. At that time, Carrey was still struggling to establish himself in the entertainment industry. The couple had one child together, their daughter, Jane Erin Carrey, who was born the same year. For several years, the marriage appeared stable. But the situation changed as Carrey's career expanded in the early 1990s. The rapid rise of his fame created a demanding work schedule that kept him away from home for long periods. At the same time, his ongoing struggle with depression placed emotional pressure on the relationship. By 1995, the marriage ended in divorce. Carrey later described the breakup as a major emotional shock, although he remained close to his daughter. The collapse of his first marriage reinforced his growing concern that personal relationships were difficult to maintain under the pressures of fame and mental health struggles. Only 1 year later, Carrey entered a second marriage. In 1996, he married actress Lauren Holly, whom he had worked with on the film Dumb and Dumber. The relationship developed quickly and attracted significant media attention because both actors were highly visible in Hollywood at the time. However, the marriage lasted less than a year. By 1997, the couple separated and finalized their divorce. Observers at the time pointed to the intense public scrutiny surrounding the relationship and the constant attention from entertainment media as contributing factors. For Carrey, the short-lived marriage added another failed relationship to an already growing list of personal disappointments in the years that followed. He entered several high-profile romantic relationships, One of the most widely discussed was with actress Renee Zellweger, whom he met while filming Me, Myself, and Irene in 1999. The two actors became engaged and appeared frequently together in public events and interviews, despite the apparent closeness. The engagement ended in 2000. After the breakup, Zellweger publicly described the separation as the result of personal growth and changing priorities, while Carrey acknowledged that the relationship had ended during a complicated emotional period in his life. Several years later, Carrey entered another long relationship with actress and television personality Jenny McCarthy. The couple began dating in 2005 and remained together for nearly 5 years. During this period, they often appeared publicly as a supportive and affectionate pair. However, in 2010, the relationship ended. McCarthy later explained in interviews that Carrey's ongoing struggles with depression played a significant role in the breakup. She described the emotional distance that sometimes developed when he withdrew during periods of psychological stress. These repeated relationship failures gradually reinforced a pattern in Carrey's personal life. Each breakup added to a growing sense that stable long-term partnerships were difficult to maintain. The most devastating event occurred several years later. In 2012, Carrey began a relationship with Irish makeup artist Catriona White. Their relationship was intermittent and included several periods of separation and reconciliation. Friends described the connection as emotionally intense but unstable. In September 2015, White died in Los Angeles after ingesting a combination of prescription medications. Authorities later ruled her death a suicide caused by a drug overdose. News of her death shocked both the public and Carrey himself. Reports revealed that White had left a note before her death. In the message, she apologized to Carrey and expressed regret about the difficulties surrounding their relationship. Carrey publicly responded with grief, stating that he had spent several days in disbelief after learning of her death. In one statement, he said, "I've spent 3 days now in disbelief that you're not here." The tragedy quickly escalated into a legal controversy. White's estranged husband and her mother filed civil lawsuits against Carrey, accusing him of wrongful death. The lawsuits alleged that he had provided the prescription drugs involved in the overdose and had exposed White to a destructive lifestyle involving drugs and risky behavior. Additional claims accused him of transmitting a sexually transmitted infection. The accusations generated intense media coverage and damaged Carrey's public reputation. Some outlets even described him using extreme labels that implied responsibility for White's death. Carrey denied the allegations and fought the lawsuits in court. The legal battle lasted approximately 3 years and placed significant emotional pressure on him during that time. In 2018, the case was ultimately dismissed, and Carrey was cleared of the accusations, even though he won the legal dispute. The experience left a lasting impact. Following the controversy, Carrey began stepping away from the traditional Hollywood spotlight. He spent more time focusing on painting, writing, and personal reflection rather than pursuing a constant stream of film projects. The pattern of repeated loss in relationships also echoed the emotional instability he experienced earlier in life. From childhood fears about losing his parents to the collapse of multiple relationships as an adult. The theme of emotional loss appeared again and again in his personal story. These experiences contributed to the deep introspection that now defines the later stage of his life.